From Royce Gracie getting demolished in his return to Rashad Evans, who went 2-6 inside the octagon. Here are a few UFC fighters who definitely should have quit sooner. Starting things off is Royce Gracie. Royce was the face of MMA in the early days of the UFC. He's still one of the greatest influencers of modern-day MMA competition. When UFC first started, he proved himself by defeating a number of giants who were way bigger than he was. The incredible MMA fighter won 3 UFC tournaments, after which he left the company to pursue different things.
There's the tap. There's the tap. Royce actually had him in a choke from the back, and he tapped. He tapped 4 times.
But that wasn't the end of his UFC career, though it should have been. He returned to the UFC 5 years later to take part in the Japanese Pride events. To everyone's surprise, he lost the fight against Kazushi Sakuraba, and his next 3 fights had 2 draws. At this point, most people wished he'd retired as a legend instead of coming back again. But Royce Gracie wanted to prove himself yet again. He decided to return to the UFC and face Matt Hughes. Now, at that time, Hughes was in the prime of his career, so even though Gracie had a height and reach advantage over him at UFC 60 when the two faced one another, Royce was clearly out of his depth. He just couldn't keep up with Matt and his supreme skill set. Matt pretty much instantly closed the show with a technical KO in the first round. After that point, Gracie went on to beat UFC veterans Ken Shamrock and Kazushi Sakuraba, and he finally retired on a good winning streak. Well, I'm glad he retired when he did, but he would have saved face if he'd retired way sooner, just like another MMA fighter I'm thinking of. He's none other than Rashad Evans.
And Ives fighting to the finish. This is such a close fight. He's down.
Rashad was the former UFC light heavyweight champ, and boy, was he talented. He was gifted with exceptional skills in the mixed martial arts department. He had a record of 12-1-1 before he lost the title to John Jones at UFC 145. The secret to his success was that Rashad was simply great. He was good at everything. Though he was never one for knockouts, his fights were always interesting. I remember tuning in to watch Evans mix his elite tier wrestling with his smooth boxing combos. He just knew his opponent in the cage was about to have a rough night. As good as Rashad is at MMA, he's also the very definition of a fighter who isn't willing to accept that he's way past his expiry date. He just wasn't willing to accept that he didn't have it anymore. After he lost the title of light heavyweight champion, his age began to catch up to him. In a painful turn of events, the world saw him go 2-6 inside the octagon. It was pretty hard watching the once celebrated fighter chase after crumbs of victory. The world wanted to see him retire, but there he was, chasing that last victory. I mean, it was pretty embarrassing to watch. Speaking of embarrassing, I can't forget about this next fighter, Josh Koscheck. When he was in his prime, Josh was the embodiment of talent and skill in the cage. He was an NCAA Division I wrestler and a pretty well-rounded mixed martial arts fighter. What's interesting is that Josh entered the UFC pretty early on in his career. He had only had 2 fights in his MMA career when he joined the UFC family. In hindsight, it looks like he was a pretty underrated fighter. He went on a terrible losing streak, but before that, he had a record of 15-5 in the UFC. He even faced off against Georges St-Pierre at UFC 124 for a welterweight belt. He lost by a decision, but he bounced back with an incredible knockout victory when he defeated Matt Hughes at UFC 135.
He's out cold. It is all over. Josh Koscheck has knocked out Matt Hughes.
To this day, his win against Hughes is considered one of the best moments of his career. Unfortunately, his career took a nosedive right after this, and he never really recovered from it. He went on to lose the next 5 fights. The UFC decided to release him in 2015 because of this. Josh wasn't one to give up though. He joined the Bellator promotion, but his days of glory were far behind, and he lost to an unknown fighter by the name of Mauricio Alonso. Koscheck finally took the hint and retired in 2018. But this next fighter didn't, unfortunately. He's none other than BJ Penn. The athlete was one of a kind. Known as the Prodigy, this MMA fighter definitely left his mark on the UFC world. Before joining the UFC, the passionate fighter was a professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. He even won the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship in 2000, which is what led him to compete in mixed martial arts. BJ was the former UFC lightweight and welterweight champ. When he was still in the early days of his career, BJ moved on to the welterweight division and challenged Hughes for the welterweight strap. Even though he was pretty much still the underdog, Penn managed to find a way to subdue his opponent. He beat Matt in the very first round and became the champion. He was super aggressive, and his fights were always exciting to watch. But after an amazing run, things just weren't the same after some time, and things especially went downhill when he lost to Nick Diaz at UFC 137. He went on to lose all of his fights in the next 9 years. He lost 7 fights in a row, including the matchup against Diaz. After he lost the 7th match, UFC finally released him in 2019. He also had a lot of personal issues going on outside the cage, so maybe that was for the best. Penn never got a chance to redeem himself though, which sucks. If he'd only retired sooner. That reminds me of one more fighter who didn't retire soon enough, Wanderlei Silva. When he was in his prime, Silva was the scariest fighter out there. He was even nicknamed the Axe Murderer. Just like the name suggests, he absolutely brutalized his opponents in his glory days in the Pride. But it looks like his aggression clouded his thinking a little bit. Instead of retiring, Wanderlei continued to fight long after he'd passed his prime, which meant he had to suffer some devastating losses late in his career. Once he joined the UFC Octagon in 2007, his days as a ferocious MMA fighter were already coming to an end. In fact, I thought he'd retired with grace after defeating Brian Stann in 2013, but for some unknown reason, he decided to push his luck. Silva came back in 2017 and signed with the Bellator promotion. He faced some old rivals inside the Bellator cage, like Chael Sonnen and Quinton Jackson. He was a completely different fighter in those days. He didn't look like his old self at all. He was slow and way out of shape. The result? He was practically destroyed by Rampage Jackson at Bellator 206. It was pretty tough to watch the MMA legend being unable to accept that it was over for him, just like it was with this last guy I'm gonna talk about, Kazushi Sakuraba. The Japanese legend became a UFC Hall of Famer in 2017 and holds numerous MMA records. Despite being a very accomplished wrestler, Sakuraba refused to hang up and retire long after his prime. As a result, he ended his career with a 2-7 record in his last 9 matchups, including a 5-match losing streak. And I think you can all agree that was a pretty sad ending for the MMA legend. I mean, it was a massive fall from grace. That's all about the UFC fighters who should have retired way earlier than they did.